2 months before taking the oath of office, Franklin Pierce stood in the snow and watched his son die. A train derailment crushed the 11-year-old boy's skull right in front of him. Pierce survived the crash, but he never recovered. He walked into the White House a broken man. His wife locked herself in her room writing letters to the dead child. Pierce locked himself in the bottle. He spent his presidency managing trauma, not policy. When he finally left power, he admitted the only truth he had left. There's nothing left to do but get drunk. It was a pathetic end for a man born into a world of iron and stone. Geography is destiny, they say, and Franklin Pierce was carved from the landscape of Hillsborough, New Hampshire. It was a rugged, unforgiving place in 1804, a land of stone walls and long, biting winters. But the most imposing feature of Franklin's landscape wasn't a mountain. It was his father, Benjamin Pierce. Franklin cannot be analyzed without confronting the titan that was Benjamin. Benjamin Pierce was a force of nature, a rough-hewn, uneducated, terrifyingly competent hero of the American Revolution. He had fought at Bunker Hill. He had survived Valley Forge. He was a man who had killed redcoats with his bare hands and built a political dynasty out of sheer willpower. He was the governor of New Hampshire, a man who rode horses hard, drank hard, and spoke with the thunderous authority of a patriarch who had literally built the country. Franklin was the beautiful son. Born into this aristocracy of violence and prestige, he was the golden child. But he was different from Benjamin. Where the father was granite, the son was marble, polished, smooth, but prone to cracking under pressure. Franklin inherited the ambition, but he did not inherit the grit. From his earliest memories, Franklin's existence was defined by a need to please this overwhelming father figure. He learned early on that the way to survive in the shadow of a giant is not to fight, but to adapt, to smile, to agree, to become whatever the giant needed him to be. This was the incubation of the dough face. A dough face is a mask made of soft bread. You can press your thumb into it and change its expression. Franklin learned that charm was his armor. If he could make people like him, if he could smooth over the edges of a conversation with a joke or a compliment, he could avoid the conflict that terrified him. He became a people pleaser of the highest order. But in politics, the instinct to please everyone is a fatal pathology. It means you have no center. It means you belong to the last person who spoke to you. In 1820, the Golden Boy was sent to Bowdoin College in Maine. It is here that the tragedy begins to acquire its cast of characters. Bowdoin was a small, intense world of intellect and privilege. It was here that Franklin met Nathaniel Hawthorne, a brooding, handsome young man with dark eyes who saw the world through a lens of hidden sins and moral decay. They became inseparable. Hawthorne, who would go on to write the Scarlet Letter, saw something in Franklin, a brightness, a social ease that Hawthorne himself lacked. But Hawthorne also saw the cracks. It was at Bowdoin that Franklin discovered the elixir that would become his medicine, his best friend, and his eventual executioner, alcohol. In the 1820s, drinking wasn't just a social activity, it was the fuel of masculine camaraderie. But for Franklin, it was different. Observers from the time noted that Pierce didn't just drink for fun, he drank for relief. There was a nervous energy to him, a frantic need for validation that only quieted down after the third or fourth glass of Madeira. The alcohol numbed the anxiety of expectation. It made the shadow of his father recede. It made him feel like the hero everyone said he was. He was the ringleader of the Athenian Society, a group known more for its tavern bills than its scholarship. He was beloved. He was the most popular boy in class. He graduated 5th in his class, not because of brilliant intellect, but because he knew how to play the game. He knew how to make the professors smile. He knew how to navigate the system. He was failing upward, buoyed by charm and the right connections. If his father was the fire that forged his ambition, his wife was the ice that froze his soul. In 1834, Franklin Pierce married Jane Means Appleton. To the outside observer, it was a logical union of two prominent New England families. But to a detective looking at the psychological profiles, it was a disaster waiting to happen. It was a collision of matter and antimatter. Franklin was the son of a rough-and-tumble Jacksonian Democrat. He was loud, he loved parties, he loved politics, and he loved the noise of the tavern. Jane Appleton was the daughter of a strict, elitist Whig college president. She was a creature of extreme fragility. She was deeply, morbidly religious in the Calvinist tradition, obsessed with sin, judgment, and the frailty of the flesh. She was tubercular, constantly sick, weighing hardly anything, a ghost in a lace dress. She despised politics. She despised noise. And most of all, she despised alcohol. Why did they marry? Perhaps Franklin thought he could save her with his charm. Perhaps Jane thought she could reform him with her piety. It is the classic trap of the romantic, falling in love with a potential, not a person. The marriage was a torture chamber of quiet resentment from day one. Jane hated Washington, D.C. She found the capital to be a swamp of vice and immorality. She hated Franklin's friends. She hated his ambition. Every time he won an election, she saw it not as a victory, but as a curse that pulled him further into the sinful world of power. She became the voice in his ear, the Greek chorus of doom. While the public saw a rising political star, charming and handsome, the private Franklin Pierce came home to a house filled with silence, sickness, and judgment. He was living a double life. In the Senate, he was the jovial companion, the good old boy. At home, he was the disappointing sinner, tiptoeing around a wife who looked at him with eyes full of holy sorrow. This dynamic created a frantic oscillation in his career. He was elected to the House of Representatives, then the Senate, rising with meteoric speed. He was the youngest senator at the time. But Jane's misery was a constant gravitational pull. She fainted at the news of his victories. She wrote him letters filled with melancholy and scripture, begging him to leave the Sodom of Washington. And here we see the first major manifestation of his weakness. A stronger man might have drawn a line, either leaving the politics he loved or convincing his wife to adapt. Pierce did neither. He compromised. He agonized. He drank more to deal with the guilt of making her unhappy, then felt more guilty about the drinking, which made her more unhappy. It was a feedback loop of misery. In 1842, at the height of his powers, he resigned from the Senate. He gave up one of the most powerful positions in the country simply to appease Jane. They moved back to Concord, New Hampshire. He promised her he was done with public life. He promised her he would be a simple lawyer. He promised her the ambition was dead. But ambition is like a cancer. You can't just wish it away. It went dormant, festering beneath the surface. He spent the next decade in New Hampshire, becoming the state's most powerful political boss, running the party machine from behind the scenes while pretending to be a retired gentleman for Jane's sake. He was living a lie. He was a caged animal pacing the floor of a small town, watching his friends in Washington shape history while he sat in a parlor listening to his wife cough. The monotony was broken in 1846 by the Mexican-American War. For Pierce, this wasn't just a war. It was an escape hatch. It was a chance to finally equal his father's glory. It was a chance to prove to himself that he wasn't just a lawyer with a drinking problem. He enlisted immediately, using his connections to get a commission as a brigadier general. Jane was horrified, but Franklin was ecstatic. He rode off to Mexico dreaming of charges, sabers, and glory. What he got was a humiliation so profound it would become a punchline. The reality of war is visceral, not romantic. In his first major action at the Battle of Contreras, the defining moment of his military life arrived. As the cannons roared and the order to advance was given, Pierce spurred his horse forward. But the terrain was jagged lava rock. His horse bucked violently. Pierce was thrown forward, his groin smashing into the pommel of the saddle with agonizing force. The horse then fell, pinning his leg. The pain was blinding. He passed out. When he woke up, the battle was raging without him. His men were moving forward, and he was lying in the dirt, crippled by pain and a twisted knee. He tried to rejoin the fight the next day, but he was so injured he had to be strapped to his horse. In the subsequent battle of Churubusco, the pain was so intense he fainted again in the saddle. He returned to New Hampshire not as the hero of Valley Forge like his father, but as the fainting general. His political enemies back home howled with laughter. They printed pamphlets accusing him of cowardice. Franklin Pierce, the hero of many a well-fought battle, they sneered. Implying he was drunk in the saddle, it wasn't true. He was genuinely injured, but the narrative stuck. The gap between who he wanted to be, the warrior statesman, and who he was, the frail, unlucky lawyer, was widening. He retreated back to Concord, back to the bottle, back to Jane's silent judgment. He thought his life was over. He was approaching 50. He was a washed-up ex-senator with a bad leg and a worse reputation. But history has a strange way of recycling broken men. The year 1852 was approaching, and the Democratic Party was desperate. They didn't want a hero. They didn't want a giant. They wanted someone pliable. They wanted a ghost. And Franklin Pierce was the perfect specter. The summer of 1852 was sweltering. In Baltimore, the Democratic National Convention gathered in a hall that felt less like a political assembly and more like a gladiatorial pit. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the smell of unwashed wool, and the nervous sweat of desperate men. The Democratic Party, much like the nation itself, was a ticking bomb. The tension between the northern free states and the southern slave states was at a breaking point, and the delegates knew that whoever they picked had to be a magician. They needed someone who could look a northerner in the eye and promise progress, then turn to a southerner and promise protection for their peculiar institution of slavery. The tragedy of this convention, and by extension the tragedy of the decade, was that the party actually had strong men. They had giants. There was Lewis Cass, the aging warhorse from Michigan. There was James Buchanan, the seasoned diplomat with the resume of a king. And there was Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant, a man of boundless energy and fierce intellect. For days, these giants tore each other apart. Ballot after ballot was cast. The delegates shouted, bargained, and drank, but no one could reach the required two-thirds majority. Cass was too old. Buchanan was too northern. Douglas was too controversial. They were deadlocked. It was a stalemate born of hatred and rivalry. By the 30th ballot, the convention was exhausted. By the 40th, they were desperate. They didn't need a leader anymore. They needed a way out. They needed a blank slate. This is the precise moment when history turns on a dime. It is the moment when the dark horse emerges from the shadows. Franklin Pierce was not in Baltimore. He was back in New Hampshire, sitting quietly, nursing a drink, assuring his terrified wife Jane that his political career was over. He had no delegates. He had no campaign manager. He was, for all intents and purposes, a retired soldier lawyer with a bad leg. But in the back rooms of Baltimore, a group of frantic power brokers began to whisper his name. Why Pierce? Not because of his brilliance, not because of his vision, but because of his availability. He was a northerner who hated abolitionists. He was a man with no strong enemies because he had never taken a strong stand. He was the perfect political clay. On the 35th ballot, Virginia threw a few votes his way as a test. A ripple went through the hall. Who? Pierce? The fainting general? But as the giants continued to bludgeon each other into submission, the idea of Pierce began to look appealing. He was safe. He was handsome. He was pliable. On the 49th ballot, the dam broke. The exhausted delegates, desperate to go home, stampeded toward the nobody from New Hampshire. Franklin Pierce was nominated unanimously. It was not a victory of merit. It was a victory of exhaustion. He was chosen because he was the only man in the room who stood for absolutely nothing, and therefore could be imagined to stand for everything. When the news reached New Hampshire via telegraph, it did not bring joy. It brought a funeral atmosphere to the Pierce household. Franklin was stunned. He hadn't lifted a finger to get this. But Jane was devastated. She fainted when she heard the news. When she came to, she wept. She had spent 10 years praying for her husband to be delivered from the evils of Washington. She believed they had escaped. She believed God had answered her prayers for a quiet life. Now, the monster of ambition had returned to swallow their family whole. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but emotionally true, that Benny, their 11-year-old son, wrote a letter to his mother during this time. I hope he won't be elected, for I should not like to live in Washington, and I know you would not either. The family viewed the nomination not as a blessing, but as a looming catastrophe. But Franklin, ever the man of weak will, could not say no. The old hunger for validation, the ghost of his father whispering in his ear, was too strong. He accepted the nomination. The machinery of the doughface began to turn. Now came the problem. The Democratic Party had nominated a man that half the country had never heard of, and the other half remembered as the man who fell off his horse in Mexico. The opposition party, the Whigs, were running General Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, a genuine towering war hero. How do you sell a fainting lawyer against a conquering general? You lie, but you don't just lie with crude posters. You lie with art. Franklin Pierce turned to his old college friend, Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is one of the strangest partnerships in American history. Hawthorne was a genius, a man who saw the darkness in the human soul clearer than anyone. He was currently famous for The Scarlet Letter, a book about hidden sin and the crushing weight of guilt. Why would a man of such profound insight agree to write a puff piece, a propaganda biography for a mediocre politician? Loyalty, and perhaps a shared sense of fatalism. Hawthorne agreed to write the life of Franklin Pierce. He later called it This Wretched Little Business, but he did it. Hawthorne's book was a masterpiece of gaslighting. He took the raw, disappointing clay of Franklin Pierce and sculpted a marble statue. The alcoholism? Hawthorne spun it as conviviality and a warm social nature. The lack of strong political stances? Hawthorne described it as steady, unwavering patriotism and a refusal to be swayed by radical passions, a code word for abolitionism. But the greatest feat of fiction was the war record. Hawthorne had to deal with the fainting general rumors. He couldn't deny Pierce fell off the horse. There were too many witnesses. So he rewrote the context. He depicted Pierce as a man of superhuman endurance who, despite a catastrophic injury that would have crippled a lesser man, tied himself to his saddle to lead his men into the teeth of the enemy fire. He turned a clumsy accident into a martyrdom. Hawthorne wrote, "He had not the soldier's professional training, but he had the soldier's heart and a courage that would not be denied." It was beautiful. It was moving. And it was largely nonsense. This biography was printed by the thousands. It was distributed to every corner of the Union. Voters who had no idea who Pierce was read Hawthorne's elegant prose and imagined a Cincinnatus, a humble citizen soldier leaving his plow to save the Republic. They didn't see the nervous man with the brandy glass. They saw the hero Hawthorne had invented. The election of 1852 was not one on excitement, it was one on fear. The Whigs, running General Scott, were divided. The Northern Whigs hated slavery. The Southern Whigs feared Scott was too close to the abolitionists. The party was cracking. Pierce, on the other hand, offered the most seductive drug in politics: stability. To the South, Pierce was perfect. He was a Northerner who said all the right things. He called the abolitionists fanatics. He argued that the Constitution protected slavery and that the Compromise of 1850, which included the hated Fugitive Slave Act, was the final word on the matter. "No more agitation" was the unofficial slogan. To the North, he was sold as a moderate, a man who would keep the Union together, a man who wouldn't rock the boat. It was a campaign of silence. Pierce didn't make speeches. He stayed home in Concord, letting Hawthorne's book and the party machine do the talking. He was the man of the center. But in 1852, the center was a killing field. To stand in the center meant you had to ignore the moral rot eating away at the nation's soul. Pierce was willing to ignore it. He was willing to trade moral clarity for political peace. On Election Day, the result was a landslide. Pierce crushed Winfield Scott in the Electoral College 254 to 42. It looked like a mandate. It looked like the country had united behind this handsome, charming man from New Hampshire. The Democrats celebrated. They believed they had killed the Whig Party, which, to be fair, they had. The Whigs never recovered. They believed they had secured a generation of peace. But history provides a cruel irony. The American people hadn't voted for Franklin Pierce. They had voted for a phantom. They had voted for the character in Hawthorne's book. They had voted for the idea that if they just picked a nice, quiet man, the slavery issue would go away. Pierce sat in his home in Concord, the president-elect of the United States. He should have been elated. He had surpassed his father. He had vindicated his name. He was the most powerful man in the hemisphere. But the atmosphere in the Pierce home was not one of celebration. It was one of dread. Jane was preparing for the move to Washington, like a woman preparing for the gallows. She was packing her trunks with a grim, silent efficiency. Benny was anxious. And Franklin? He felt the weight of the mask he was wearing. He knew deep down that he was not the man in Hawthorne's book. He knew he was the man who needed a drink to get through the morning. He knew he was the man who deferred to stronger wills. He had won the prize, but he had yet to pay the cost. The universe demands a balance. He had achieved a height he was not built to sustain, and the fall was already being prepared. The winter of 1852 set in. The snow began to pile up on the tracks of the Boston and Maine Railroad. The Pierce family made their plans to travel. They packed their bags. They said their goodbyes. They boarded the train. The distance between triumph and total ruin is often measured in inches. For Franklin Pierce, it was measured in the microscopic hairline fracture of a train axle. It is January 6, 1853. The election is over. The victory is secured. The Pierce family, Franklin, Jane, and 11-year-old Benjamin, are traveling from Boston back to Concord. They had attended a funeral for a family friend, a somber occasion, but the mood on the train was arguably lighter than it had been in months. The uncertainty of the campaign was gone. They were simply a family in transit. They boarded the midday train. The car was comfortable, heated against the biting New England winter. Benny was the only child remaining to them. Their first son, Franklin Jr., had died 3 days after birth. Their second, Frank Robert, had died of typhus at age 4. Benny was not just a son, he was the survivor. He was the repository of all their hopes, the fragile vessel that held the marriage together. Just minutes after leaving the Andover station, moving at roughly 40 miles per hour, the train rounded a curve near a rocky embankment. There was a sharp, metallic snap. An axle on a passenger car fractured. The car did not just derail, it buckled and swung violently off the tracks, careening down a steep 20-foot embankment. It rolled, sheared against the rocks, and came to a rest in a field of snow and jagged stone. Inside, the world turned upside down. Wood splintered like matchsticks. Glass exploded. The noise was deafening, the screech of metal, the roar of the impact, and then the sudden, terrifying silence of the aftermath. Franklin Pierce was bruised, shaken, but conscious. He scrambled up from the debris. His first instinct, primal and immediate, was to find his wife. Jane was battered, dazed, but alive. Then he looked for Benny. What Franklin Pierce saw in that next second is the image that would effectively end his presidency before it began. It is an image of such graphic violence that it seems cruel to recount, but necessary to understand the man who followed. Benny had not been thrown clear. He had been struck by the shifting wreckage. Franklin found his son's body. The boy's head had been essentially crushed by the falling debris. There was no hope. There was no final words. There was only the brutal, undeniable biology of death. Franklin instinctively grabbed his coat and threw it over his son's body. A desperate, futile attempt to shield Jane from the sight. But it was too late. She had seen it. She saw the blood soaking into the pristine white snow. She saw the gruesome reality of her last child reduced to broken matter. In that frozen field in Andover, the president-elect died. The man who stood up from the wreckage was a husk. To understand the paralysis of the Pierce presidency, you have to understand the specific flavor of religious guilt that consumed him. This was the 19th century. Accidents were rarely seen as random physics. They were seen as providence. For Jane Pierce, the message was clear and unforgiving. God was angry. She believed with a terrifying certainty that God had taken Benny because Franklin had accepted the nomination. The presidency was a sinful ambition, and God had demanded a blood sacrifice to punish them for it. But for Franklin, the guilt was even more complex and corrosive. He looked at the wreckage and saw a transaction. He believed that God had removed the distraction of his son so that he could belong wholly to the nation. It was a cruel Old Testament logic. You wanted to be father of the country? Fine. Then you cannot be a father to a son. He was crushed by a paradox. He believed he was cursed, yet he was obligated to lead. He felt he was being punished for the very job he was about to start. The weeks leading up to the inauguration were a phantasmagoria of grief. Jane did not attend the funeral. She stayed in her room, rocking back and forth, writing letters to the dead boy. Franklin had to stand by the grave alone, surrounded by political allies who were already jostling for cabinet positions, whispering about patronage while he stared at the coffin. He began to drink heavily again, not socially, not for fun. He drank to obliterate the image of the coat over the boy's head. Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1853, was one of the bleakest days in the history of the Capitol. The weather mirrored the man, cold, windy, with snow flurries whipping through the muddy streets of Washington. Usually, an inauguration is a coronation. There are balls, parades, music. Pierce canceled the inaugural ball. It would have been grotesque to dance while the earth on Benny's grave was still fresh. When he stepped onto the platform at the east port of the Capitol, the crowd saw a man who looked like he had aged 20 years and 2 months. He was thin, pale, and his eyes were hollow. Then he did something unprecedented. When the Chief Justice held out the Bible for the oath of office, Franklin Pierce refused to place his hand on it. He did not swear, he affirmed. Historians debate why. Some say it was a legalistic New England quirk, but the psychological profile suggests something darker. He felt he had no right to touch the holy book. He felt abandoned by God, or perhaps he felt that his hand was too stained with the sin of ambition to rest on the gospel. He was a man severed from his faith, standing alone in the wind. He delivered his inaugural address from memory, 3,319 words, without looking at a single note. It was a feat of intellectual discipline that masked his emotional shattering. The speech was eloquent, but it was the speech of a man trying to convince himself that he still existed. He spoke of peace, he spoke of union, he spoke of the eternal principles of the Constitution. But the crowd was quiet. They weren't cheering a conqueror, they were witnessing a funeral rite. In the speech, he made a heartbreaking allusion to his loss. "You have summoned me in my weakness. You must sustain me by your strength." It was a plea for help. He was begging the American people to hold him up because he could no longer stand on his own. The new president moved into the executive mansion, but it felt more like moving into a mausoleum. Jane Pierce did not come with him immediately. She arrived later, a wraith in black mourning veils. She bypassed the public rooms and went straight to the second floor, to the private quarters. She effectively vanished from public life. She became the shadow of the White House. Servants whispered about hearing her weeping at night. She wrote letters to Benny asking him to haunt her, begging for a glimpse of his ghost. She left pencils and paper on tables, hoping he would write back from the grave. Franklin was left alone downstairs. The White House, usually the bustling center of social life, fell silent. There were no levees, no gaiety. The president would wander the halls late at night, a candle in one hand, a glass in the other, listening to the silence. This is the state of the American executive branch in 1853. A clinically depressed president, a catatonic first lady, and a void where the will to govern should have been. It is a fundamental law of politics that power abhors a vacuum. If the man at the top is hollow, power will not disappear. It will flow to the people around him. It will flow to the strongest wills, the loudest voices, the most certain ideologues. Franklin Pierce sat at his desk, staring at papers he couldn't focus on. He wanted peace. He wanted to make everyone happy so the screaming in his head would stop. He was a man stripped of his defenses, his confidence shattered on a train track in Andover. And waiting in the wings, watching this broken man with hawk-like intensity, was Jefferson Davis. The future president of the Confederacy saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. He saw a vessel that could be filled with Southern ambition. The ghosts had taken over the White House. Now, the demons were coming for the country. When Franklin Pierce took his seat at the Resolute desk, or its equivalent in 1853, the United States was a machine vibrating with kinetic energy. Railroads were tearing across the landscape. Telegraph wires were stitching the states together, and the economy was booming. The nation was screaming for direction. It needed a conductor. Instead, it got a spectator. The tragedy of the Pierce administration is not that it had no plan. It is that its plan was a fantasy born of the president's psychological need to be liked. Pierce entered office with a strategy called the Cabinet of All Factions. His idea, naive, charming, and disastrous, was to bring all the warring tribes of the Democratic Party under one roof. He would invite the die-hard Unionists and the fire-eating secessionists, the Northern doughfaces and the Southern aristocrats. He believed, with the delusion of a man who hates conflict, that if he just put them all in a room and smiled enough, they would get along. He treated the governance of a fracturing empire like a dinner party in New Hampshire. But politics is not a dinner party. It is a biological struggle for dominance. When you put wolves and sheep in the same room, you don't get peace. You get well-fed wolves. We cannot tell the story of Franklin Pierce without understanding the profound, almost magnetic hold Jefferson Davis had over him. They were a study in contrasts. Pierce was fluid, emotional, guilt-ridden, and northern. Davis was rigid, intellectual, self-righteous, and deeply Southern. Davis, the new Secretary of War, was everything Pierce wished he could be. Davis had a genuine war record from Mexico that didn't involve falling off a horse. Davis had a moral certainty that bordered on fanaticism. He believed in the righteousness of the South and the sanctity of slavery with a cold, clear logic that cut through Pierce's foggy ambivalence. They had met during the Mexican War, and Pierce had admired him then. Now, in the vacuum of his grief, Pierce didn't just admire Davis, he clung to him. Davis became more than a cabinet member. He became the president's psychological anchor. While Jane Pierce was haunting the upstairs corridors, weeping for her dead son, Jefferson Davis was downstairs, filling the silence with a clear, authoritative voice. He offered Pierce the one thing the president craved more than anything: certainty. Davis always knew what to do. Davis never doubted. And so, the cabinet of all factions quickly mutated into the cabinet of Jefferson Davis. The Secretary of War began to run the government. He didn't do it through a coup. He did it through the slow, subtle osmosis of will. When Pierce was too drunk or too depressed to make a decision, he looked to Davis. When Pierce needed to draft a speech, Davis held the pen. Historians often note that Pierce's cabinet is the only one in U.S. history where no member resigned or was fired for the full 4 years. This is usually presented as a trivia fact indicating stability. In reality, it was a symptom of rigor mortis. Pierce was too terrified of conflict to fire anyone. To remove a cabinet member would require a confrontation, a scene, a moment of unpleasantness that Pierce simply could not stomach. So they stayed. The cabinet became a frozen tableau, locked in place by the president's paralysis. And within that frozen structure, the Southern Bloc maneuvered with absolute freedom. While Davis was capturing the political soul of the White House, Jane Pierce was defining its spiritual atmosphere. The White House in the 1850s was not the fortress it is today. It was a public house, a mansion that was supposed to belong to the people. But under the Pierces, it became a tomb. Jane, the shadow of the White House, turned the second floor into a shrine to sorrow. She wore the deepest black mourning weeds every day. She refused to host the social events that were the lifeblood of Washington diplomacy. The levees, the public receptions, were canceled or held in a grim, joyless fashion. There are accounts of White House staff finding Jane sitting in the yellow Oval Room, writing letters to Benny. She would ask him questions. Did you feel the pain? Do you see me now? She would leave these letters on the table, waiting for a reply that never came. For Franklin, coming home to the residential quarters was not a respite. It was a confrontation with his own failure. Every time he looked at Jane, he saw the accusation in her eyes. You did this. Your ambition killed him. To escape the shadow upstairs, Pierce spent more and more time downstairs in the smoky offices with his men, specifically Davis. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The more miserable his home life, the more he sought the masculine validation of his Southern advisors. The South became his refuge. The North, with its abolitionist critics and his judging wife, became the source of his pain. We must treat the subject of Pierce's alcoholism with clinical objectivity, not judgment. For Pierce, alcohol was not a party favor, it was an anesthetic. He was a man in severe psychological pain, suffering from what we would today diagnose as complex PTSD and profound depression. He was a functioning alcoholic, which in many ways is more dangerous for a leader than a chaotic drunk. He could stand up, he could speak, he could sign papers, but his judgment was permanently impaired. Alcohol softens the edges of reality. It makes the unthinkable seem acceptable. It makes compromise feel like the only option. When you are viewing the world through a haze of Madeira and brandy, the hard lines of morality blur. The slave power did not need to bribe Pierce. They just needed to pour him a drink and tell him he was a good man, a sophisticated man, a man who understood the complexities of the Constitution. They flattered him into submission. This submission manifested in the patronage system, the spoils system. In the 19th century, the president had the power to appoint thousands of federal jobs: postmasters, customs collectors, marshals. It was the currency of political power. Pierce, desperate to buy loyalty and peace, used this patronage like a man throwing raw meat to wolves. But because he was guided by Davis and his Southern allies, the vast majority of these powerful positions went to men who were sympathetic to slavery. He appointed Caleb Cushing, a brilliant but morally flexible Northerner, another doughface, as Attorney General. Cushing worked hand in glove with Davis to stack the federal courts with pro-slavery judges. He appointed diplomatic envoys who were aggressively expansionist, dreaming of annexing Cuba to create more slave states. Bit by bit, appointment by appointment, the federal government was being rewired. The machinery of the United States, its courts, its army, its diplomatic corps, was being turned into a weapon for the South. Pierce didn't see it as a conspiracy. He saw it as fairness. He believed he was simply giving the South its due. He was blinded by his obsession with the Constitution as a static document. He argued that since the Constitution recognized slavery, the federal government had a duty to protect it actively. He told himself he was a strict constructionist. In reality, he was an accomplice. It is a typical evening in the Pierce White House in late 1853. Outside, the wind howls off the Potomac. The gas lights flicker in the hallways. Upstairs, Jane Pierce is sitting by a cold fireplace, holding a lock of Benny's hair, staring into the middle distance. The silence is heavy, broken only by the scratching of her pen as she writes another letter to the dead. Downstairs in the library, the air is thick with cigar smoke. Franklin Pierce sits in a leather chair, his face flushed, a glass in his hand. He's laughing at a joke, leaning forward, eager to please. Opposite him sits Jefferson Davis. Davis is not drinking. He's sitting straight, his eyes sharp, his voice low and hypnotic. He is talking about property rights. He is talking about the fanatics in Boston who want to destroy the Union. He is talking about a new bill that is being drafted, a bill that will settle the slavery question once and for all. Pierce nods. He agrees. He wants to be the statesman who solved the problem. He wants the approval of this strong iron man. Yes, Pierce says, the alcohol warming his belly and dulling the grief. We must stand firm. We must follow the Constitution. He doesn't know it yet, but in that library, amidst the smoke and the brandy, they are drafting the death warrant of the Union. They are preparing the poison pill that will kill the compromise and set the nation on fire. The ghosts are running the house and they are hungry for blood. Crimes in Washington, D.C. are rarely committed with a gun. They are committed with a pen, usually in a quiet room, by men who tell themselves they are doing the necessary thing. The most consequential crime of the 19th century took place on a Sunday. This is significant because Franklin Pierce was a strict Sabbatarian. He did not work on the Lord's Day. It was a rule he held sacred, perhaps one of the few structures left in his crumbling life. But on Sunday, January 22nd, 1854, the wolves came knocking. Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant of Illinois, arrived at the White House with Jefferson Davis in tow. Douglas was a steam engine in human form, short, loud, brilliant, and utterly consumed by ambition. He wanted to build a transcontinental railroad. To do that, he needed to organize the vast western territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and to get the South to agree to that, he needed to give them something they desperately wanted: slavery. Douglas slammed a piece of paper onto the president's desk. It was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The bill was a sledgehammer. It proposed to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the sacred line that had kept the peace for 34 years by banning slavery in the North. Douglas proposed popular sovereignty. Let the settlers decide. Let them vote on slavery. Pierce hesitated. Even in his fog, he knew this was dangerous. He knew breaking the Missouri Compromise would enrage the North. It was a breach of a sacred contract. But Douglas bullied him. Davis cajoled him. They boxed him in. They used his own weakness against him, arguing that popular sovereignty was the most democratic solution. Who could argue with letting the people vote, Mr. President? Pierce, the man who could not say no, the man who needed to be liked by the strong men in the room, folded. He broke his Sabbath rule. He agreed to make the bill an administration measure. With that agreement, Franklin Pierce didn't just sign a bill. He pulled the pin on a grenade and rolled it into the center of the American living room. When the act passed in May 1854, the explosion was instantaneous. In the North, the reaction was not just anger, it was fury. They saw it as a betrayal of biblical proportions. Pierce was burned in effigy in towns across New England. He was no longer seen as a doughface, a harmless sympathizer. He was now viewed as a tool of the slave power, a traitor who had sold his own homeland to the Southern aristocracy. Pierce was baffled. He sat in the White House reading the vicious editorials, drinking his brandy and asking, "Why do they hate me? I gave them democracy." He failed to understand the fatal flaw of popular sovereignty. You cannot have a democratic vote on a moral abomination. You cannot ask people to calmly mark a ballot on whether or not another human being should be owned as chattel. By removing the legal barrier to slavery, Pierce didn't bring democracy to Kansas. He brought anarchy. Now the story shifts from the marble halls of Washington to the muddy, bloody plains of Kansas. This is where the doughface policy met reality. Pierce thought settlers would go there and vote peacefully. Instead, Kansas became a magnet for extremists. From the South came the border ruffians, thousands of heavily armed men from Missouri. They weren't settlers, they were an invasion force. They rode across the border, whiskey on their breath and Bowie knives in their belts, to terrorize the free state settlers. They seized polling places, they stuffed ballot boxes. In one district with only 600 legal voters, they cast 3,000 votes for slavery. From the North came the Jayhawkers and the New England Immigrant Aid Company, sending rifles packed in crates marked Bibles. Kansas ceased to be a territory. It became a war zone. What did Franklin Pierce do as American citizens began to hunt each other for sport? He did what he always did. He looked to Jefferson Davis for instructions. The fraudulent pro-slavery legislature in Kansas, elected by the Missouri mob, passed laws that were insane in their cruelty. It became a crime punishable by death to help a fugitive slave. It became a felony even to speak against slavery. A strong president would have declared the election void. A strong president would have sent the army to protect the sanctity of the vote. Pierce recognized the fraud. He validated it. He threw the full weight of the federal government behind the border ruffians. He declared the free state settlers who tried to form their own government in Topeka to be traitors and rebels. This was the death blow to his presidency. He was using the U.S. Army to enforce a stolen election on behalf of slaveholders. He had become a tyrant, not out of strength, but out of weakness. The violence spiraled. In May 1856, a pro-slavery posse of 800 men, acting with the tacit approval of Pierce's appointed officials, descended on the Free State town of Lawrence. They dragged cannons to the top of a hill. They shelled the Free State Hotel. They burned the governor's house. They smashed the printing presses of the abolitionist newspapers and threw the type into the river. It was a sack, pure and simple. And out of the smoke of Lawrence rose the inevitable consequence of Pierce's failure, John Brown. If Pierce was the ghost, John Brown was the Old Testament come to life. He was a man who believed that since the law, represented by Pierce, had failed, only blood could purge the sin of the land. 3 days after the sack of Lawrence, John Brown and his sons went to Potawatomi Creek. In the dead of night, they dragged 5 pro-slavery men out of their cabins. They didn't shoot them. They hacked them to death with broadswords. It was intimate, gruesome, biblical violence. This was Bleeding Kansas, a civil war in miniature, and every drop of blood spilled on that prairie could be traced back to the desk of Franklin Pierce, where he sat paralyzed, refusing to admit he was wrong. The madness in Kansas couldn't be contained. It traveled back to Washington like a contagion. On May 22, 1856, just before the Potawatomi Massacre, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech. It was a blistering attack on the South and on Pierce, a noisome, squat, and nameless animal, he called Douglas. He mocked the South's chivalry. 2 days later, Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, walked onto the floor of the Senate. He found Sumner trapped at his desk. Brooks raised a heavy gutta-percha cane with a gold head and began to beat Sumner over the head. He struck him again and again. Sumner, blinded by his own blood, ripped the desk bolted to the floor in his struggle to escape. Brooks didn't stop until the cane shattered. Sumner lay unconscious in a pool of blood on the Senate floor. The symbolism was inescapable. The time for words was over. The violence of the frontier had entered the Capitol. And where was the president? The nation looked to the White House for a condemnation. They looked for moral leadership. A president should be outraged that a senator was nearly beaten to death in the legislative chamber. Pierce said nothing, actually worse than nothing. In private, he sympathized with Brooks. He felt Sumner had provoked it. He invited Brooks to White House dinners. To the North, this was the final straw. Pierce wasn't just incompetent, he was complicit. He was cheering on the thugs. By the summer of 1856, Franklin Pierce was a political corpse. He just didn't know it yet. He had alienated the North so completely that he was practically a foreign enemy in his own home states. But here is the supreme irony, the dramatic irony we spoke of. He had also lost the South. The South, led by the very men Pierce had tried so hard to please, looked at him with contempt. They saw Kansas spiraling into chaos. They saw that Pierce, despite all his concessions, couldn't actually deliver a stable pro-slavery state. He was too weak to enforce order. The South didn't want a doughface anymore. They realized that a Northern puppet was useless if he couldn't control his own strings. They needed a real Southerner, or at least a stronger man. Pierce had sold his soul to buy their love, and they looked at him with disgust. The Democratic National Convention of 1856 was approaching. Pierce expected to be renominated. He deluded himself into thinking he had saved the Union by signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He thought the party owed him. He was about to discover that in politics, there is no gratitude. There is only utility. And Franklin Pierce had outlived his usefulness. In the summer of 1856, the Democratic Party gathered in Cincinnati to choose their champion. Franklin Pierce sat in the White House waiting for the telegram that would confirm his renomination. He genuinely believed he deserved it. In his mind, a mind increasingly clouded by alcohol and surrounded by sycophants, he had done exactly what the party asked. He had opened the West, he had placated the South, he had upheld the Constitution. But the Democratic Party is a machine, not a family, and machines have no loyalty to broken parts. The power brokers looked at the map. They looked at bleeding Kansas. They looked at the outrage in the North. They realized that Franklin Pierce was radioactive. He was a toxic asset. If they ran him again, they would lose the North entirely. So they did something cold and unprecedented. They ghosted a sitting president. They turned to James Buchanan, a man who had spent the last few years as ambassador to Britain, safely across the ocean, far away from the bloodstains of Kansas. He was chosen simply because he wasn't Franklin Pierce. When the news reached the White House, Pierce was stunned. He became the first elected president in American history to be actively denied a second term by his own party. It was a public repudiation. It was a statement that his 4 years had been not just a failure, but a mistake they wished to erase. On March 4th, 1857, Franklin Pierce stood on the inaugural platform one last time. He watched James Buchanan take the oath. He watched the burden pass to another man, a man who would arguably do an even worse job, but that is a story for another day. As Pierce prepared to leave Washington, a reporter or perhaps a friend, the accounts vary, asked him what he intended to do now that he was a private citizen again. Pierce's answer is one of the most famous and most devastating quotes in presidential history. It is the epitaph of his soul. He didn't say he would write his memoirs. He didn't say he would build a library. He said, well, there is nothing left to do but get drunk. It wasn't a joke. It was a plan. Franklin and Jane left Washington, but they couldn't go home, not really. New Hampshire was cold, both in weather and in welcome. The neighbors who had once celebrated him now looked at him with suspicion or pity. So they did what 19th century aristocrats did when they were running from their ghosts. They went to Europe. For 2 years, the Pierces wandered the continent. It was a macabre vacation. Jane carried Benny's Bible everywhere she went. She was dying slowly of tuberculosis and melancholy. Franklin dragged her from spa to spa, from Madeira to Rome, trying to find a climate that would heal her lungs or a distraction that would heal his heart. They found neither. In Rome, they met up with Nathaniel Hawthorne again. Hawthorne was shocked by what he saw. He wrote in his journals that Pierce seemed hollowed out, a man whose inner light had been extinguished. The charm was still there, but it was brittle. The drinking was constant. They were two tragic figures drifting through the ruins of old empires, while their own empire back home was catching fire. They returned to America in 1860, just in time to watch the house collapse. When Abraham Lincoln was elected and the southern states began to secede, the country demanded clarity. You were either for the Union or against it. Franklin Pierce, true to his tragic nature, chose the wrong side of history one last time. He didn't join the Confederacy. He was a New Hampshire man, after all. But he loudly, publicly, and repeatedly blamed the war on the North. He blamed Lincoln. He blamed the abolitionists. In his warped view, the South was the victim. They were merely defending their constitutional property rights against Northern aggression. He wrote letters calling the Civil War cruel, heartless, aimless, and unnecessary. This was not just an unpopular opinion, it was social suicide. When the news of the firing on Fort Sumter reached Concord, a mob gathered outside Pierce's home. They demanded he come out and fly the American flag to show his loyalty. Pierce, showing a flash of the old defiance, stepped onto his porch. He told the mob that his father had fought for that flag and he didn't need to prove his patriotism to a rabble. The mob dispersed, but the silence that followed was worse. Pierce became a pariah. His old friends crossed the street to avoid him. He was accused of being a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society of pro-Confederate spies. It wasn't true, but it shows how much his own people despised him. He spent the war years in a boozy haze, writing angry letters that no one read, defending a world that had already ceased to exist. In 1863, the first major blow of the endgame arrived. Jane Pierce died. She passed away in Andover, Massachusetts, not far from the site of the train crash that had destroyed her life 10 years earlier. In her final days, she had finally found some peace, largely by completely detaching herself from reality. Franklin was devastated. Despite the misery of their marriage, she was his anchor. She was the only person who understood the pain of the train tracks. Without her, he was completely untethered. He buried her in the freezing ground of the Old North Cemetery in Concord, next to Benny. He stood by the grave, a widower, a failed president, a hated citizen. The final emotional blow came a year later, in 1864. Nathaniel Hawthorne died. Hawthorne was the one man who had never abandoned him. Even when Pierce was the most hated man in New England, Hawthorne had dedicated his final book to him, writing, "If he is so exceedingly unpopular that his name is enough to sink the volume, there is so much the more need that an old friend should stand by him." Pierce traveled to Concord, Massachusetts for the funeral. It was a gathering of the literary giants of the age, Emerson, Longfellow, Whittier. But when they walked to the grave, a heartbreaking scene unfolded. Pierce was a pallbearer. He walked alongside the coffin of the man who had created his myth. But the other mourners, the great intellectuals of the North, refused to walk near him. They shunned him. At the graveside, Pierce tried to adjust the collar of Hawthorne's coat in the coffin, a final gesture of tenderness. It was the act of a man desperate for connection. But after the service, he was left standing alone. He wasn't just a political failure. He was a moral leper. The last 5 years of his life were a slow, wet suicide. He retreated to a cottage on the coast of New Hampshire. He drank. He drank to forget the war. He drank to forget Jane. He drank to forget the face of Benny in the snow. His health failed rapidly. He developed dropsy, severe swelling, and cirrhosis of the liver. The charm that had once dazzled Washington faded into the bloated, red-faced mask of late-stage alcoholism. He turned to religion in the end, finally being baptized in the Episcopal Church, seeking the forgiveness he never felt he received from the Calvinist God of his wife. On an October morning in 1869, the doughface finally stopped breathing. There was no grand state funeral. There was no weeping nation. President Ulysses S. Grant declared a day of mourning, but it was a formality. The country was busy rebuilding. They didn't want to think about Franklin Pierce. He was a reminder of the bad old days, a reminder of the compromise that failed. He was buried in the Minot enclosure in Concord. If you go there today, you will see a statue of him. He looks commanding, confident, a finger pointing toward the horizon. It is, fittingly, one last lie. The man in the ground beneath the statue was not commanding. He was a man who had been broken into pieces and who spent his life trying to hold the shards together with whiskey and denial. He died as he had governed, trying to please everyone and ending up with no one. When the coffin of Franklin Pierce was lowered into the ground in 1869, the United States was a different planet than the one he had governed just 12 years prior. The silence of the 1850s had been replaced by the roar of industry and the scars of a war that had killed 750,000 men. Pierce was buried in that silence. For decades, he was largely forgotten, a dusty portrait in the hallway of history that school children walked past without a second glance. The tragedy of Franklin Pierce is the tragedy of the good man in the bad time. By all accounts, Franklin Pierce was a lovely individual. He was kind to his servants. He was a loyal friend. He was a loving, if devastated, father. In a small town in New Hampshire, he would have been the most beloved man in the community. But the White House is not a small town. It is a crucible. Pierce allows us to confront a dangerous truth. Personal likability is not political morality. We often vote for the candidate we would like to have a beer with. Franklin Pierce was exactly that candidate. But the qualities that made him a good drinking buddy, his malleability, his desire to please, his aversion to conflict, made him a catastrophic president. He proved that a leader who cannot tolerate being hated will eventually become the most hated man of all. By trying to please the South, he lost the North. By trying to uphold the Constitution as a static document, he destroyed the Union it was meant to hold together. He tried to be everyone's friend, and he ended up being the enemy of the future. When we look back at the 1850s, through the smoke of the Civil War, we see a long line of dominoes falling. And standing at the front of that line with a trembling hand and a broken heart is Franklin Pierce. He tipped the first one, not out of malice, but because he was too weak to hold it up. He was the president of the compromise that killed the country. He was the man who let the ghosts in. And in the end, he became one of them.